Christianity has a tremendous need for a psychology like Jung's, and the widespread interest on the part of Christians in his psychology can be taken as a recognition of that fact. But the Jungian-Christian dialogue has been going on for more than 40 years, and something keeps it from flourishing. In this series of profiles, we're going to meet people involved in different facets of this dialogue and try to discover what is happening in it today and what hopes there are for it in the future. Today we are in London to meet John Costello.
I think it's fair to say that I never choose to be a Jungian analyst. I came to Jungian analysis as someone in need of help, and at that time of my life I was in utter confusion on a whole lot of fields, but mainly in the area of what I would now describe as spiritual. So I came into Jungian analysis, and for me it was like a duck discovering water for the first time. And there was a completely natural affinity between sort of my own dispositions and my own interaction with sort of my own psyche and unconscious. From there it went on to I becoming a Jungian analyst and bringing with me my own Catholicism. It also sort of became a real sort of subject of interest, personal sort of development and the like in a big way. So I carry all that sort of religious belief, religious background into Jungian analysis. Once I had qualified as a Jungian analyst, I set up practice in the normal way. And then people started coming to see me, male, female, believers, non-believers, and whatever. But after some time it became obvious that a certain segment of people who were coming to see me because I was a Catholic, I was a believer, I was a Christian. And they very definitely wanted something that, someone who at least understood what they believed in, and they also wanted to discover how that related to their own inner workings, is the only way I could describe it. And sometimes you discovered that the problem was to do with their own psychological makeup. Other times you discover that their understanding of what they thought that they believed, or what they believed, was not at all very clear, or they had sort of put some type of a slant on it that was not really in line with their beliefs. And certainly on other occasions it would be the case of it not being in line with their own psychological disposition. So you had a very interesting type of dynamic emerging. On the one hand you had a belief that was not fitting into a psychological disposition, or on the other hand you had a psychological disposition that was having great difficulty in grasping the depth, the significance, the meaning, the value of the religious belief. And that's where it started to arise. And there were a small number of us here in London who sort of had that type of psychological disposition and belief. We were interested in it, and we found that there was always a problem in trying to find suitable therapists and analysts where this type of interaction could be, successfully brought to some type of conclusion. And it was out of that need that we decided to try and train some individuals along those lines who would spot and be aware of the need for that interface between the psychological on the one hand and the religious on the other hand. So it required, in psychological terminology, quite a sort of important commitment to what Jung called the religious attitude. And I think that's probably where the two coincide. The person of religion needs a religious attitude. The person who is committed to the whole idea of depth psychology and the unconscious also needs a religious attitude. And my belief is that the two are very closely interconnected, possibly even the same. I wouldn't be at all too sure, but I wouldn't make that claim, but they certainly are very, very closely related. And that's where the overlap comes. Trying to answer your question around what type of problems do we get presented by Catholics, and the one certainly I've come across, I could certainly say that these two that I'm going to mention are definitely the most popular that I've come across. And the first one is this whole business of being oneself and being selfish. And there is a real psychological problem around it nowadays, because a lot of individuals seem to think that they have an identity, when in fact they're very busy looking for an identity. And in psychological terms, we would talk about these people as people who do not have egos. Now, there's a serious problem here if they do not have an ego, because I suppose the teaching would say that in order to be selfless, you've got to sacrifice yourself. Now, how can you sacrifice something you have not got? It's simply impossible. And I think people get into tremendous amounts of confusion through sacrificing something that they haven't got. I don't know what they end up sacrificing. I would hesitate even to call it sacrifice, but there's certainly, you can certainly say that there is no transformation brought about in these individuals, nothing whatever. And so that what the work of psychology is going to achieve is to give these individuals egos, give them a sense of themselves. Now, if you have a sense of yourself and a sense of who you are, then you might be able to get down to be selfless. And it's really at that point you probably link up your personality with your beliefs. There is a path, there's a movement forward for progression and development, both psychologically and spiritually. Now, the other problem that I come across very often is somewhat linked to that, and that is the whole area of religious experience. And I think that nowadays far more individuals have religious experience, but they actually don't know that it's religious experience. And I'm reasonably good myself at sniffing out individuals where I think they may have had religious experience. And it's not easy to ask the question directly, but if you go at it in some indirect way, they eventually will, with great reluctance and fear and trepidation, disclose that something quite important happened to them. But they're absolutely afraid, first of all, that you will say that it is insignificant, that it's rubbish, or that sort of you'll just simply laugh at it. And so that when they tell me these things, I sort of listen very carefully, and if I sort of recognize what they're talking about, I usually tend to reach towards one of my books on the bookshelf, open up and read something for them, and I ask them, is it something like that? And I would say in all cases that where it has happened, it has come down to the fact that the individual has had, in fact, an experience of God. Now, the first thing is they did not have either the knowledge about these experiences. The second thing is they neither did they have a terminology about these experiences. So I have to give them confirmation of what they've, or affirmation of what they've experienced, and also some type of a terminology. There's of course a much greater problem, which is how does that integrate in with their own sort of belief system and their own religion. That is kind of left for a later stage. But trying to actually uncover that is a huge problem, and there seems to be a great reluctance on these individuals to bring those types of experiences to their clergyman, or even for their clergyman to listen to them with a degree of sensitivity and sympathy. And very often anyway, the clergyman doesn't have that expertise and knowledge nowadays. It's certainly not available at parish level, I think, in most cases. They're more apt to be pushed aside. So those types of individuals, very often, their only option is to come and to someone like me and see if I can do something for them. One of the frequently asked questions that I get is, why did we, in fact, have to start such a training group? Now, the difficulty arose more from the type of person that came to see us, because they often complained that they had great difficulty in finding therapists and analysts who could provide a sort of a dual track hearing for them. On the one side, you had a kindly ear for their religious beliefs, and on the other hand, you had an ear that sort of listened to the psychological side. Now, what we discovered, a small group of us, and indeed a very small group here in London, was that we shared a common ground with that type of individual, because we, as it were, provided a type of platform or a meeting place for those two aspects to come together, and in which we were able to at least provide some resolution of the conflicts that arose between those two areas. Now, I think it's quite important to emphasize that it's not everyone, or all Catholics, or all individuals who are interested in psychology would have that type of conflict. But there is very definitely a type of individual which we identified who has got that type of need. And that type of individual would not tend to go to what I would call the straightforward psychologist on the one hand, or on the other hand, probably go for spiritual direction. They would need someone with the common ground of religion and psychology. And it is that type of individual that we've identified, and it's that type of area that we also identified as not being catered for out there among people. So it is out of that type of thinking that we set up this small training group for individuals who are interested in that type of interface between religion and psychology, and who would want to know more in how to help that type of individual that we've identified. Now, it is out of that type of grouping that the training group started some 10 years ago, and we spent some 4 or 5 years trying to get our thinking right in it and planning it, and then 4 or 5 years ago we actually started the training, and it's now underway. What is different from the other trainings psychological trainings, it's quite difficult to actually put into words, but I'll try. And probably it's better to sort of talk about what people say about it rather than what we believe ourselves. Now, one of the things that we are absolutely adamant on is that the training insists that the individuals have a really thorough psychological grounding. So in other words, that they have a thorough experience of psyche, as much knowledge as is possible. We mainly follow, I suppose nearly exclusively follow, a sort of the Jungian model of the psyche, because we find that eminently suitable for our purposes. I think that it interlinks and interfaces with sort of the Christian spiritual traditions, and it is possible to make the links and identify sort of the common ground, and some places the actual psychological stroke spiritual realities. And it's a question of how you look at these realities is what determines the type of terminology that you may use from time to time. Now, we do that. We also, I wouldn't say give emphasis, but certainly there's complete space for individuals to sort of talk about their spiritual and religious beliefs. I had earlier this year a woman came to see me, and she was doing a psychotherapy training, and I was interviewing her for that training. It wasn't for our own training, and one of her biggest regrets was, she says, it is extremely difficult for me with my therapist to talk about anything religious or to even talk about God. Now, in our particular training, there would be absolutely no problem with that. It would be a given. We wouldn't even know what the problem was about if someone came saying, I don't think I can talk about God or about my religion. It is a given. We accept it. And there's certainly no attempt to sort of marginalize those types of beliefs or those realities. There's no attempt at sort of try and see them as compensations only. I always remember the woman who came to see me, and she says, I believe in God, but she says, you know, when you look at it psychologically, I don't know whether it's a belief in God I'm talking about, or whether God is just simply a compensation for a lot of other things in my life. Now, that is precisely where we try to come in and try and help an individual. And I think it depends entirely how that individual believes in God. If they don't believe in God, God might just be a compensation for an individual. Now, so be it, but we're more or less interested in the individual who does believe in God, and how does it fit in to the psychological makeup of that individual. And it's that type of thing, that subtle interaction all the time, because there is an awful lot of sort of neurotic sort of how should I say, reactions to this interface between the psychological and the religious, because very often individuals hide behind, as it were, the religious belief. And sometimes where there's a very strong religious belief, it in fact can be seen as militating against both the psychological and spiritual development of the individual. So in other words, I wouldn't say that as a group interested in psychology that we would always be staving up what you'd call the alleged religious belief of the individual. We would at least trying to get at what the subjective truth is for that individual. And it's a very, very interesting area, the extent to which people use religion as an escape rather than a means of development for themselves. And that is probably one of the more subtle areas that you have to get involved in, where people of strong religious disposition will invoke all sorts of religious belief against what is brought up psychologically. Obviously, in the end, those two can be brought together. But there's at the point I'm describing now, there is a huge problem, and it's very difficult because, you know, it looks as if it's set in the polarity of the religion is right or is the psychology right. Which one is it? Strictly speaking, it doesn't have to come to that, but to try and help the individual through that is a massive problem. But it is possible, and it's that type of area that we try to get into. It doesn't mean that sort of the normal sort of areas of psychological problems that any type of individual will have will thereby get neglected. No, we will deal with those as a matter of routine, and that is why we insist that the psychological grounding of our trainees is sort of impeccable, so that they can deal with any psychological problems, and psychological problems insofar as they affect or are affected by the religious dimension or the dimensions of religion, and vice versa. So it actually, what we're saying is that we would train to the level of normal psychological problems plus a special emphasis on the problems arising out of religious beliefs, religious experience, and sort of a religious sort of philosophical and theological position. Now, the question of whether the training that we offer at the present time could be of any use to people involved in the art of spiritual directing raises quite an interesting question. I don't think that I can actually answer the question directly, but what I can tell you is what has happened over the years. And over the years, I've had many requests from individuals, priests, nuns, lay people, who've been trained in spiritual direction. And what they have come to realize in the course of acting as spiritual directors, that they possibly need some further deepening and understanding of individuals, and that aspect that they feel that is missing very often is the psychological dimension. That while they've been trained for the spiritual dimension of the individual, as it were, they need further training, understanding, and know-how of the psychological, because successful spiritual direction doesn't seem to be possible without some sort of development and understanding of the psychological. So these types of individuals who reach that particular point of understanding say that they need a further understanding and a deeper understanding of the psychological, so that they can bring those two together as they meet them in individuals. Now, for that type of individual, this type of training and the type of therapist that we would produce would be extremely useful and helpful to that type of spiritual director. So there definitely would be something to offer. How much, I think, depends on the actual need of that spiritual director. And I don't think I can go any further on that one at the moment, because that's more or less where it stands at present. But there is certainly not, it's more on an individual sort of basis of individual spiritual director seeking requirement, rather than sort of the groups that train individuals, that train spiritual directors, I don't know anything about, I can't speak of anything on that area. But spiritual directors, yes, individuals, right?